So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I will introduce myself first. I'm Giovanna Gini, a research fellow at the MACC UK Adaptation to Climate Change Hub, also known as the MACC Hub. And this webinar is part of a series that began last month. The aim of these sessions, this is the second one, is to bring our community together to share knowledge and deepen our understanding of adaptation, particularly transformational adaptation in the UK. And today, webinar focus on improving the way we engage with vulnerability as a pathway to transformational adaptation. And why vulnerability? So in the climate change field, vulnerability has become a ubiquitous term appearing in research proposal, policy frameworks, and institutional strategy. Much work is said to be done for the vulnerable to protect them, to build the resilience, or to ensure they are taken into account. But what does it really mean to be labeled as a vulnerable person? And who have the power to decide who is a vulnerable person or a group? And how can we work constructively with the so-called vulnerable population? These are some of the questions we are here to explore today. And this is because one of the MACC Hub's goals is to make transformational adaptation actionable. And if we understand transformational adaptation as challenging the system and the structure that produce climate risk and injustice, then we must critically engage with the concept of vulnerability. This is why with this in mind, we have invited 5 outstanding professionals who work either directly with vulnerable population or with the concept itself. I will give them the space to introduce, so they can introduce themselves. But I can just say that I'm very happy that we are here today and that the speakers have accepted the invitation. And I will first give the floor to Stanley Townsend.
Thanks, Giovanna. Happy Monday, happy morning to everyone. So I'm Stan. I'm based in South Wales and I work for a NGO called Climate Cymru. Cymru means Wales in Welsh, for those that don't know. We are a coalition-based NGO of almost 400 largely community groups in Wales that all kind of gathered together to call for more fair and urgent climate action in Wales. Myself particularly largely focused on the sort of politics and policy kind of space. Particularly important in Wales, seeing as we've got national elections in our Welsh Parliament, what's called the Senedd, next May, which is rapidly approaching. A bit more, I suppose, on my background, just to help, I guess, contextualize, situate where my thinking in this webinar kind of comes from. So I guess I'm approaching vulnerability and this kind of conversation through my observations working in the world of climate policy, which is a space I've moved around and meandered quite a lot in. I guess I've seen the centre of UK government's approach to climate change through being in a number of different policy roles within DEFRA, Treasury, Cabinet Office. I was a negotiator within the UN climate process at several different COPs, so seeing what the international multilateral approach looks like, we've advised different governments outside of the UK, and with a few different consultancies, also advised political parties in Wales, which I think is of kind of particular interest given Wales does actually have a slightly different framing and worldview when it comes to climate change, given it's far more about social justice by way of our kind of history of unjust economic transitions, which is pertinent to me sort of sitting in the industrial heartlands of the South Wales valleys. And yeah, now working for NGO based in Wales, it's highly focused on the role of communities and community agencies in transformative change to address not just the climate crisis, but all its intersections. And yeah, really anchored in what a people-centered transition could look like and taking a slightly deeper look as to why we are where we are or where we're not. And a lot of that is focused around kind of storytelling within community and sort of narrative change when it comes to the climate crisis and anything it interacts with. So yeah, thank you for having me. Lovely to be here. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Giovanna.
Thank you so much, Stan. Thank you for accepting the invitation, even if it was a little bit last minute. The next speaker is Satwat. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. from a sunny Edinburgh this morning after an extremely rainy weekend. My name is Satwat Rehman and I'm here wearing two hats. One, with my day job, I'm Chief Executive at One Parent Families Scotland. We work with single parents across Scotland, supporting them with some of the issues that they experience in the here and now, but also working with them and taking them and their experience with us when we're looking at what types of policies and structural changes need to be made. Because for us, it's very much the approach we take is that whilst people are labelled in certain ways, the causes are often institutional and structural for the challenges and the disadvantages that they're experiencing. So I would argue that what we do is we build vulnerabilities in to our systems and structures, because what we do is we look at equity and justice as afterthoughts as opposed to being central to the way we design services and structures. My other hat is I have the privilege of co-chairing Scotland's Just Transition Commission. And that is looking at how, similar to what we've just heard, it is really looking at how we put equity and justice as at the heart of this transition to net zero in a way that doesn't further disadvantage or alienate those who are currently being disadvantaged in the structures and systems we have, and also that we're not building in new inequalities in the way that we are looking at how we can get to net zero. So a lot of that has involved, we've taken a people and place-based approach. So we've spent a lot of time in different parts of Scotland, not looking necessarily at how any one change will impact on the area and on the communities who live there, but what the cumulative impact is going to be of all the changes we need to make in our daily lives and in the way that we live, we work, what we do, etc., in order for us to tackle this climate crisis. So I'll be able to talk a wee bit from both those perspectives when we go into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for accepting the invitation as well. The name is Poppy.
Hi there. So my name is Poppy, and I'm a PhD candidate at King's College London. So I'm in two different departments at King's. One of them is the School of Social Sciences and Public Policy. And I am specifically in a school called Education, Communication and Society, but I'm also in a department that works on public health and on medicine. So my research is looking at how to reduce health inequalities in disasters. Not necessarily from, not necessarily from the perspective of, what should like medics do differently or anything, but sort of looking at a more public and a social approach to it and thinking about policies. And so when I planned my PhD, there's a lot of disaster literature talking about there being a need for more research into the needs of vulnerable people, who are the people who are expected to encounter health inequalities and disasters. So that meant that was where there was research funding available, was to do that work, because that's what the literature was saying. But then if you try and do that research, you realize that vulnerable is a very vague word. And so I decided that it wasn't really for me to decide who those populations were, especially because the literature was also pretty vague about it. And so instead I asked people, what, would you consider yourself to be vulnerable? And so my research has found, I don't know if you can move the slide forward, but I did some research where I asked people if they would consider themselves vulnerable, and I also asked them, about their circumstances and any health requirements they had. And, almost always the majority of people wouldn't consider themselves vulnerable, across a whole range of circumstances, whether or not they are someone who has a caregiver or needs a service animal or needs help going to the loo, or they're on a life support machine, whatever it was. And I also did a lot of interviews with people, like a diverse range of people. And a lovely thing that one person said was, I think vulnerability is a can of worms, and what it means to you, something completely different than what it means to me. So that's kind of the basis of what my research has been looking into. has been, well, if we want to reduce health inequalities, and this is the language we're using, is it helping or might it be harming things? Because there might be a disconnection, and it might just be sustaining tropes, and it might be leaving people to fill in the blanks and make assumptions about what they think we're talking about and about who these people are. And maybe there's other ways to get around that. I don't have no idea if the slides worked or not, but yeah, I can. That's everything that I would have to say.
Thank you, Poppy. And the next one is Kate Brown.
Hi everybody, good morning. Yeah, I'm Kate Brown. I work at the University of York as a Professor of Social Policy and Criminal Justice, and I don't work in climate change, but I'm a vulnerability researcher. So I've done lots of different studies about groups who are deemed vulnerable and the practical implications of organising provision around vulnerability. And one of the first papers that I wrote was called Handle with Care. And I think that really has stood the test of time from the different studies that I've done in terms of the kind of key lessons. I'm interested in how vulnerability is lived, how it is addressed, and how it is understood, and the relationship between those things and the practical implications of how we understand it and manage it. And in particular, I'm a qualitative researcher, so I focus on the perspectives of those who are deemed vulnerable or the lived experiences of vulnerable people. And my background before as an academic was that I was a support worker and a manager in the voluntary sector in lots of different roles, but I started as a child sexual exploitation support worker in an adult sex work project. And so I became really interested in the work that vulnerability was doing in those kind of different contexts in relation to children and adults in particular. And I became convinced that it really mattered in the way that services were designed and delivered. And at the heart of this beautiful mosaic that I bring to you here are the words less protected and most vulnerable. And this mosaic was made by street sex workers in Leeds, which is where we did a study on vulnerability policing and in sex work. And vulnerability policing is really contested, and vulnerability is really contested in relation to sex work. And I found it really interesting that at the heart of this mosaic was those words very much coming from the perspective that Satwat was coming from, really about vulnerability being designed in there, and that's the conceptualization that is at the heart of the mosaic there. Then I think kind of to bring you the really overarching findings from the different studies, there's the problems of vulnerability, that it reinforces oppression, othering, stigmatization, social control. And this has been said by lots of people in lots of different areas of social policy. So take, for example, the critical disability writers or the critical sex work writers. They would kind of take a similar view that we should apply kind of rights, not rescue, in how we approach addressing marginalization, and vulnerability is often not very helpful for doing that, and can actively further marginalise people who are already marginalised. However, there is also some context for some people where vulnerability can do some really useful social justice work, illuminating the structural and institutional dimensions of disadvantage. And policing is quite an interesting context in that regard. So I'm the co-director of the ESRC Vulnerability and Policing Futures Research Centre. Policing has gone quite far in terms of its adoption of vulnerability. You'll see in the centre of the diagrams the vulnerable person. That's actually the vulnerable man, isn't it? And then around that are the kind of contextual factors that police are encouraged to think about in relation to vulnerability. So you can't see them, but it's things like poverty and adverse childhood experiences. And these are quite radical ideas when you think about understanding, for example, behaviours like drug dealing, and you start to think about vulnerability in drug dealing. It can reorientate services towards, for example, treating somebody as a victim rather than as an offender. And so there are some really kind of important developments in policing that our research centre is trying to bring bring more to the fore. I think trying to connect up the dots is always challenging because it's so different in different contexts. But one thing that comes through time and again is that it's not equally recognised who's who is vulnerable, and so vulnerability is deployed politically in highly variable ways, ascribed unevenly to people who are situated differently in light of race, gender, sexuality, and other identity related group membership. And I think so I've worked on child sexual exploitation a lot, and I always start when I'm teaching, I start talking about vulnerability, talking about Shamima Begum, who is her vulnerability was understood very differently to some of the vulnerability of other young people who were groomed like Shamima was. And so, yeah, that's a really important lesson. And then I think finally, I guess when in the studies that I've done with vulnerable people, trying to understand service provision and challenges that are kind of often put together around vulnerability, that conceptions of vulnerability look really different when you do work with people who are deemed vulnerable. So this beautiful image is the end of a co-produced animation about moving on from child sexual exploitation, and it was made with a group of young women who'd experienced CSE and wanted to get some messages out to others about CSE. And it ends with the phoenix, which is a really powerful symbol of strength and power in the face of adversity. And that is completely different conception of vulnerability to the one that we see in policy and in practice when we think about vulnerability. Does a lot of work in the field, CSE in particular. So one of the things that I've spent a lot of time trying to push forward is that if we did more work to try and close that gap between how vulnerability is understood by those who are kind of on the ground, then that might really help with supporting social justice and mitigating some of the risks that are attached to vulnerability. That's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Kate. And Jacqueline as well.
Hi, I'm not entirely sure if I haven't been able to see anybody's slides, so I'm not sure if mine are up. Can you see my opening slide there? Yeah,
Yep,
okay.
we can see it.
Hopefully this works. My name is Jacqueline O'Hagan. Thank you for having me. I am the Healthy Cities Coordinator at Belfast Healthy Cities, and I thought I would start with just a bit of an overview of who we are and what we do. The Healthy Cities Network was a response to a growing recognition that urban environments play a really key role in the health and well-being of our populations, particularly now when we see more and more of our populations residing in urban areas and cities. It emerged as a World Health Organization initiative in the late 80s, and actually Belfast very proudly was one of the first cities to receive this designation and still has it today. As you can see here, I'll not go through the stats, but it's quite a wide network. It spans across Europe and has a lot of cities involved in that collaboration and shared knowledge and learning. As a member of the WHO Healthy Cities Network, Belfast delivers on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but those development goals have been translated into a 6P framework that helps us deliver our work in a city level. And those 6Ps and themes are things that you'll probably all recognise. It's peace, planet, place, people, participation and prosperity, and they're really key to how we deliver our work. Obviously, all the cities across the European network are very different, so we have a role in Belfast and as all the other cities do in translating this in a way that really resonates with the city that we are in. We work with our local stakeholders at all levels, whether that's community and voluntary sector, statutory, academic agencies, public sector, the government sector and politicians to try and identify city-specific priorities aligned to those 6Ps. And the work we do is through creating initiatives and practices that reflect in policy. But it's really important to note that ultimately the core of all of our work is around how we identify and tackle the wider social determinants of health inequalities and health inequity. And just to really connect it to this particular theme and this particular topic, a recent report by the WHO on the social determinants of health equity did identify 5 key structural determinants. And you mentioned that, Satwat, that those structural determinants are what really has embedded that vulnerability. And those are economic systems, social infrastructure, structural discrimination, conflict, forced migration, and displacement. And they have this 5th one, megatrends, and that's where climate change and digitalization really take hold. And it's important to note that as well as having a direct health impact, climate change damages those social determinants of health, particularly among those people who are already experiencing poverty, exclusion, and poor health. So those disadvantaged groups, those vulnerable groups, those people with greater vulnerabilities will suffer disproportionately from the adverse effects from climate change, ultimately widening that gap even further. And for me, and this is my final slide, just for a bit of context on my current role, but obviously my previous role and my career as a whole, we've always taken, and I've heard it again already from some of the other speakers, that people, but also place-based approach. It's really important to break down that wider umbrella term of vulnerability and get into the nitty-gritty of who is that, who are we talking about? And through my previous role, was in place-based regeneration at a really neighbourhood level, but then feeding that into a citywide strategy. And my current role is looking at a citywide approach to place-based work. It's always been with a community development approach and community development tools. So how can we equip our communities, especially our most vulnerable communities, with the tools, resources, knowledge and education to understand how they can support themselves, but then understand how they can share their voices in policy and legislation as well. A lot of my work has been around community-led urban design. So how can we really redesign our cities with people at the forefront and right in the centre of that conversation? And particularly that's been through green and blue space interventions, which has kind of led me on to the engagement piece around community climate advocacy and community climate action. And a lot of the work to date that I've been involved in has been around how can we really ensure that the people who are the most disengaged in this conversation are actually able to engage in the conversation. How can we ensure that they're engaged in a relevant and meaningful way that actually means something to them and ensures, again, that those interventions don't serve to just widen that gap. And that's me.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, and to everyone again. I will just say 2 words about the format. We will have a panel discussion right now where we will address 4 questions that we identify as key for this conversation, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. Okay, so the first one is who is considered vulnerable and who defines this, and perhaps what are the implications behind these processes and these dynamics. So I don't know who of the speaker wants to start. Yes, Stan.
Thank you. I can kick us off, and it's already been kind of like touched on in detail by the speakers, but from my kind of world of climate policy, one of the most fundamental major issues in groups that are defined communities as vulnerable is that it's typically just done from an environmental perspective around environmental risk and sort of geographical risk to extreme weather events. And what the speakers have already touched on is that we very rarely hear politicians or policy talk about vulnerability as something more structural, i.e. it's determined by a multitude of factors way beyond those that just environmental, to take into account things like inequality, colonial legacy as well, speaking outside, but also within the UK, the impacts of austerity, racialization, and the list kind of goes on. And there's also another thing in here which I've definitely come up against quite a lot, which is the implications of this sort of binary split in climate policy around kind of mitigation and adaptation. And there's an important point here that the dimensions of vulnerability are pretty poorly applied to the mitigation of climate change and how we deliver net zero. I suppose to give a quick example, UK, Wales has a heavy focus on the electrified vehicles to decarbonise and reach net zero. That's great in decarbonisation terms. But if you extend that a little bit more broadly in context of vulnerability, that can quite easily ignore some of the economics of continued car ownership and the affordability for sections of our society, particularly lower income households. It also excludes some of the equity and health benefits of sort of modal shift and shift towards active travel. So yeah, just kind of throwing in that sort of fundamentals when it comes to climate of how vulnerability is typically viewed. I'll pause there.
Thank you, Stan. Jacqueline?
Yeah, just a really a broad few thoughts for me. That obviously I'd mentioned some of the themes that WHO have outlined in terms of structural determinants, and there are definitions on vulnerability, and I'm sure some of the other speakers have a lot more to say on those definitions. And it's important, I feel, to have those kind of indicators so we can assess who within our communities and within our populations are vulnerable. It allows us to understand the health risk for those people in light of a crisis. It allows us to ensure that resources and interventions are targeted to the right people. Particularly in climate change, it's important to ensure that any adaptation, as I mentioned before, doesn't just serve to widen that gap. But it is important to note, and other speakers have already said it, that vulnerability in itself is very complex. Vulnerability has many different definitions. You can be deemed as a vulnerable community by age, gender, cultural background, socioeconomic background, and that can be kind of a label that's put on. But also, people can fit within many different communities and have many vulnerabilities within themselves individually. And then the place that we live, the place that we are and spend our time can shape that. I think you can have a community whose base is vulnerable because they have a low economic status, a low income community in one neighbourhood that is very different to another neighbourhood in the same city. And then even within those cities, they're very different to other cities. So I think placing that kind of label across and assuming that everybody with a particular vulnerability will be susceptible to the same adaptations can be a challenge in itself. As well as that, who is placing those definitions on those communities. You know, if you were going to go, and in my previous role, we would have spoken a lot about disadvantaged and disengaged communities. But within those communities, people would not have seen themselves in that way. They would not have classed themselves as vulnerable or disadvantaged. And so if you kind of place that label on people without understanding those complexities or understanding where they're coming from, that can have a really negative impact as well. But it also prevents buy-in to the interventions and adaptations that you're trying to create. If somebody doesn't understand or hasn't created that label themselves or doesn't understand why they're vulnerable in the context of climate change, then they're less likely to be involved in shaping adaptations and interventions. And finally, and I will leave it on this, that also comes from a very negative deficit-based approach. So if you're coming into a community and suggesting that they're vulnerable and they're at risk, and you're telling them this and that you're going to fix them or help them by giving them something that they lack, that's a very deficit-based approach. I think we need to start taking a more asset-based approach where we're looking at and talking to communities, and somebody's already said that, asking them, how do you feel your community is in light of climate change? What do you feel could happen, and how could those risks factor out in you? And looking what's strong in that community, what is strong and positive, and what can we nurture and build on rather than fix.
Perfect. Satwat?
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to come in on a couple of points. One, I completely agree with what Jackie's just said about that you can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to this. I mean, that's one of the things that we've been learning throughout our work. But secondly, when we're talking about vulnerable and vulnerabilities, you know, I can see more sort of mileage in talking about vulnerabilities than vulnerable, because vulnerabilities can be created by in a range of different ways and by a range of different circumstances. Like, for example, on a very personal level, you know, as a woman of color, there are certain areas and situations in which I would be vulnerable, not created by me, not as a result of anything I've done, but as a you know, as a result of racism that there is in this society. So the issue is racism there. The issue is not the individual. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to focus on when we're talking about vulnerabilities. You know, what is it that creates that vulnerability for that person? Because that's what we need to be addressing. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, everywhere I've been, Jackie, around Scotland, the strongest leadership we've seen around the climate crisis and the urgent issues that are happening in communities, the strongest leadership we've seen is in those communities. Whilst politicians might be thinking about what do we need to do and how do we do it and how will it make us look, people are getting on with it. Yeah, so I think that strength that communities have is something that can be, as you said, utilized, but to actually take on tackling vulnerabilities. And for me, it's the whole framing around it, because the framing of people being vulnerable leads to stigma. It leads to people being put off, and it leads to people being othered. And what we also need to be very aware of is the political climate we're in at the moment, where it's very easy to other those who are slightly different or might have slightly different needs, and then scapegoat and blame them. So I think vulnerability is something we need to address also to tackle the rise in the rhetoric from the far right.
Thank you so much. Kate?
Yeah, there's so many good points being made. I think this deficit, the fact that the concept is laced with deficit is a really important dimension. But of course, so many concepts are laced with deficit that I think it's important to say I don't necessarily think that if you chuck out vulnerability and introduce something else, that solves the problem, because there's a fundamental dynamic which underpins that classification, which is, it's not going to be solved by any concept. I think it's more fundamental than a framing, even though the framing is also vital. But I think this idea of it also being like happenstance or accident or, stripping, there's a philosopher that says that it's a dangerous depoliticization. And then we need to bring back that politicization into the dynamics of understanding vulnerability. And actually, when we speak to people who are deemed vulnerable, that's what they do. When they speak about their vulnerability, they don't speak about it as something that has affected them or has happened accidentally. They understand it completely fundamentally as political, economic, structural, and that's where their orientations come from in relation to policy and practice. I think that there's quite when you think about the idea of the vulnerability and then the vulnerable groups that arises from that, so we're going to have policy around vulnerability, or who are the vulnerable groups? I think that's quite debated, and it's got a lot of debate in the context of migration, which does seem like it's quite aligned here, where there's been these designation of vulnerable groups, and then those groups are allowed certain rights and privileges, and then those who aren't deemed vulnerable are not. And then there's a lot of debate about whether that has been useful or not, and for whom. But I think it has been really important as a vehicle for giving some better rights and protections for certain groups. But then if you're going to have a kind of designation, then you've got to decide who's in and who's out. And that often is one of the problems of the doing of the policy, is that it then excludes those who might be deemed the most vulnerable, and they're not those who are necessarily the most aligned with the idea of vulnerability. And I think this specificity that's kind of come out from several commentators already is really important, and that actually, for someone not working in climate change, sometimes I look to the climate change field where I think it is a bit more specific, rather than just kind of behaviours or situations. There are these ideas about the risk of stresses and shocks, and then the risk of not being able to cope with those, and then the kind of severity of the consequences. So sometimes there's a trace of that in the climate change field. And I do think that at least tries to bring in some of the historic, political and economic dimensions, but where it's not perhaps so strong is about people's role and their action and their own agency in those situations, which I think is where it falls down. But I as a non-climate person, I always think you've got the better series of vulnerability going on in the climate field. So I'm not sure what that says, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Poppy?
So yeah, I agree with everything that's being said, especially with Kate's words. So I think even zooming out a bit more, like some of what I've done in my research is look at literally how people define vulnerability, and like not necessarily saying like how do you define vulnerability, but asking people, would you describe yourself as vulnerable, and then seeing how like in the rest of our conversation they do talk about vulnerability and the vulnerable, and like use the word vulnerable in different ways, like whether it's as a noun or as an adjective. And I think that like what I've found is basically maps together what everyone's been saying a bit. So the number one thing is that everyone thinks that other people are vulnerable. Everyone is using the word vulnerable to describe other people. And when they're doing that, they seem to be presenting this idea of someone with a lack of agency, like a deficit of agency. And as Kate said, that is underpinned by a political dynamic. So you could change the word vulnerable to be like at risk or disadvantaged or whatever it is. There would still be this dynamic. But then and then in that, there's like this implicit hierarchy where, as Satwat said, people can see that they might have situational vulnerability, that in some circumstances they're vulnerable, or in some, walking along the street at night, they feel vulnerable, but they still don't describe themselves as the most vulnerable. And there's this narrative about the most vulnerable, and it's saying like benefits are reserved for the most vulnerable, or this or that is reserved for the most vulnerable. And that's to do with this like moral obligation, as Kate said, that vulnerable groups are allowed certain rights and privileges. But if you're a person who shows any kind of agency, it's kind of saying, well, you're not really allowed those rights and privileges anymore because you're not the most vulnerable. And everyone's got agency, really. Like very, very few people, maybe, everyone, when you think of yourself, it's not natural to think of yourself as having no agency whatsoever. So that's the thing that kind of then prevents these buy-in to these schemes of, well, I can always imagine someone who's more vulnerable than me. And maybe it's not like, I mean, how can you possibly score who's the most vulnerable when everyone's lives are completely different and circumstances are different? And then the other thing that I think has happened that's arisen out of the way that policies and schemes for vulnerable people is done is that it's become something that's administered by other people. And, there are these eligibility criteria. So people are considering it as a technical term. So they don't, they're not vulnerable until someone tells them that they're vulnerable. And it's an externally defined thing. And so, it will be externally defined because you've done a assessment for benefits, or because you've received a letter in COVID to tell you you're vulnerable, or because you've received a letter to say that your household is in a flood-prone area, or whatever it is. So it's kind of saying, well, you can't even make that assessment of yourself because it's so laden with these like moral obligations, and it is defined by the people. So yeah, I guess kind of like zooming out even more of like, what do people even think this means? Well, everything that people thinks it means is like completely intertwined with politics and the way that it's used. Yeah, that's all I'd have to say.
Sorry, can I just come in quickly? Just because this is, but I think that whole framing of almost like if you're vulnerable, you're entitled to things, is being used and utilized, as we can see at the moment, to say, well, actually, what that means is that you're too great a burden on us financially. I'm thinking about the welfare reforms that are going through at the moment, particularly targeted at those with, who are disabled or might be caring for somebody who's disabled. And it then, it can quickly turn into then you're a burden, as we're seeing here now. You're a burden because your vulnerabilities are costing the state more than we can afford, and therefore we need to change that by somehow miraculously taking away your money, which will make you fit to work. So it's those types of things that we need to be really conscious of, that the way people have been labelled as having certain vulnerabilities, and I'm thinking of this in a socioeconomic way rather than a health way, also others them and makes them easy to be the targets of this is why our spending is out of control, for example, because we can't afford the welfare bill we've got. Well, actually, we could easily afford the welfare bill we've got and more if we looked at taxation. But that's not something we're willing to look at as politicians or as a country, because that would annoy people with power. And the other thing about defining as vulnerability and vulnerable groups and communities in this way is that it's about disempowering them, you know. And so I think that there's so much tied up in this debate that we're not, I mean, you know, we're almost at the end of the hour and we haven't even got past the first question, because it's so complex, but it's so integral and integrated into the way our politics is done and the way our society is structured, that we do to people all the time and then we take away from people. And I think that's one of the things that's a real danger as we move forward in all spaces, but particularly in the climate space.
Thank you, Satwat. Before giving the floor, because I know the speaker wants to speak, and just for also like trying to move forward the discussion before opening to the Q&A, when you're responding to you know, when you are explaining your reactions, I was thinking that maybe you can also like perhaps offering a way of rethinking language, but not only language, I will say also if you think or if you have put in practice any strategies of how to deal with this issue in what we do, right, in research, in policy, and so yes, if you have any strategy for the audience. Kate?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can't believe we're nearly at the end and then we've just got into it. So yeah, I think it's kind of telling of what an important issue it is. I think for me, there's just working with people to try and understand and frame the problems together and having a diversity of perspectives and people in that problem construction and framing. That's something that as academics we're not very good at traditionally, and we need to get better at it because we're part of the issue there, because we go off and read our books and that's where we decide that. I mean, that's not really how we do it anymore, to be honest, but I think there is that legacy and that's similar to how policy and how social policy and how practice has been developed, very much through the kind of idea of reform. We need to reform things, make things better, and therefore there's a default kind of people in need of reform, which we've kind of identified is not a good way to start. And then I guess more specifically, I've been looking at different vulnerability ideas for a long time, and I think I have settled on a favourite for a while now, which is a philosopher who writes really accessible philosophy, and her name's Erin Gilson, and she writes about violence, specifically violence against women. And so for me, as somebody interested in kind of oppression, social control and harm, that's a really important, I think sometimes that's missing from when we see vulnerability used. People don't think about all the harms, and so I like it for that. And then she talks about reactive assertions, which are common sense and instinctual, and they tend towards reactionary outcomes. And then this obscures the structural, institutional, historic dimensions of how vulnerability is produced. And then she talks about progressive vulnerability that has to be critically attuned to existing power dynamics and their histories. And then I think when you do co-production, that's where you end up naturally, because this more diverse conversation, then it opens up all of those kind of critical perspectives, or whatever we want to call them, kind of more progressive, collaborative perspectives. So for me, that's where I think we need to go if we are going to try and use the idea or the notion of vulnerability for social justice, then I think there's some of the ways that we might start, at least.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Kate. Stan?
Thank you. I'm going to try and refrain from waxing lyric about all the issues with international climate finance and development aid, because there's so many parallels to Satwat's example of the kind of welfare state. And it's an interesting example in the context of kind of global geopolitics as well, and how this issue plays out at a kind of international level. But I'll shift onto the kind of rethinking, reimagining, and doing differently. And one of the tools that gives me a lot of active hope that I'm quite passionate about is different kind of governance tools and systems to really center citizens' knowledge and citizens' agency. And that's a relevance here, but it's also something that just goes so more deeply into the kind of politics of why we are where we are in terms of our collective response to the climate crisis. And this can take many forms, from anything from sort of centering, embedding, respecting Indigenous practices, all the way through to what I'm quite passionate about with, which is deliberative and participative forms of democracy, because they give genuine kind of agency and power to citizens and the diversity of citizens' kind of perspectives and their sort of situations in life, and helps connect that to all the very myriad number of intersections with kind of climate policy at different levels. And it will help build trust and legitimacy, or use and harness those lived experiences to better design change that is not determined from the ivory towers of Westminster or Cathays in Cardiff, or Holyrood in Scotland, etc. And it just will help empower the public to really meaningfully engage in these complex issues, which they don't really have a kind of voice at the moment to the level they need. And one of the reasons why I know I feel so hopeful about kind of participative and deliberative democracy is that it terrifies politicians, which I think is quite telling. I'm happy to wax lyric about that more, but I'll pause because I'm keen to hear from others.
Thank you, Stan. That was a little bit of hope in there. Jacqueline?
Probably going to sound very similar to yourself, Stan. I think we're coming from a similar perspective in a similar space. A really good example happened to me quite recently, and even with my experience and background, where I was developing a program for young people around climate and health, and particularly trying to target that at young people from what would be classed as some of those more vulnerable communities. And in a conversation with a youth worker from an umbrella organisation who regularly engages with that particular group, she'd noticed that I'd put in eco-anxiety as one of the things that we could possibly look at. And her first thought to me was, none of the young people I'm talking to have identified eco-anxiety as an issue in their day-to-day lives. I'm working with young people who are struggling in homes where there is very regularly food problems, food poverty, mental health issues, complex backgrounds, and so they are not seeing eco-anxiety as an issue. And it just brought that back home, whereas I'm not saying it's not a thing. Eco-anxiety is certainly something that young people are dealing with, but not particularly all young people, and certainly not the young people classed in that vulnerable group. So I suppose it just kind of brought back home to me even that we need to be going in and asking people, as you say, deliberative democracy, we need to be asking people, do they feel that they're vulnerable? How do they feel that they're vulnerable in relation to climate change? And I'm helping them to come along the way, educating, informing in a way that's not just telling them that they're vulnerable and telling them that their community is going to be more at risk to climate change, but helping them to understand why that is by involving them in the process from the start. And there are tools and methods and practices that can do that. And then we need to empower people to feel that their voices are actually informing decision making. Look at the table. Look at who is at that table making the decisions around vulnerability, making decisions around policy and adaptation, and who's not there and who should be there. And how do we ensure that they feel that they can be there? And yes, I agree. I come from a very practitioner-based background, so this is something we have been doing in the community and voluntary sector for years. I am starting to see policymakers looking at these practices and trying to incorporate them in. We've still a long way to go, but I do also agree there is hope there that this is something that is starting to change.
Poppy?
I didn't realize my mic was off already. So I would say, yeah, totally. I totally agree about co-production and communication and collaboration. I think that, yeah, there's a long way to go, and it's about like I think maybe as Kate said, or as Jacqueline said, like reducing that gap between people who are talking about the vulnerable and people who are being deemed as vulnerable. And I think that like in the meantime, while all of this conversation is happening, like there are still going to be these narratives, and that, you know, people are still going to be using words. And I think that a good thing that can be done is very simplistic, but I guess a lot of my research is aimed at informing policymakers about what to do in a crisis, like whether it's whether it's to do with the climate crisis or another crisis, like sort of by a hostile actor. And that's very reactive. And so the advice that I've been giving in my research is just to try and use more specific language to describe who you're talking to. So whether that would be, say, you were talking about food poverty, Jackie, whether it's saying, you know, if you are someone who uses a food bank however often per month, or if you're someone in your household is on free school meals, please come and access this thing, just to take away that fill in the gaps aspect of it. Or if it's about age, saying if you are this age or under, or this age or over, just like being very specific, not implying anything. You know, if you can explain why, that's even better. It's not to like avoid the conversation, but it's just to like try and avoid the problems in the meantime while the conversation is being had. That would be a practical solution I would present, I guess.
Thank you, Poppy. There are so many questions and reactions to what you were saying in the chat. We won't have time to answer all of them, but maybe we can try in the last 7 minutes. So one of the questions is, how do we get to changing the narrative and get to the point that we as a society, we uphold human rights for all? Is a question from Frederick in the chat. Poppy, yes. I don't know if you put your hands up.
Yeah, that's a very big question, and I don't have an answer to it. But I would say part of the problem is just the way our society is. It is competitive, and like people are competing for a resource, and so it is being designed in a way that isn't ensuring, you know, access for all or resource for all. There is this undertone, this sort of assumption underneath it, this dynamic underneath it, that only a special few should be able to access something. And like, as I think we've all discussed, no one is born. I think that there is a truth that everyone is born vulnerable, and then, you know, in the lives that we have around us, we have different privileges. And so, yeah, because we can see these differences, and, you know, we can see like inequalities, it feels, and you know, and because we live in a capitalist society, I suppose, like it's not natural for people to be thinking that, you know, thinking about equity. Sorry, that's not really an answer to your question, but I just think that it's like a very, very big problem, and I wish that I had an answer, I guess is what I was saying.
Don't worry, it is a very, very big issue. Satwat?
I think that's a really interesting question, because we as a society here in the United Kingdom on a whole don't really think about ourselves as citizens with rights. So I think that there's a framing thing there that we need to be thinking about. But what I will say is it needs to go beyond bits of legislation, and it needs to, you know, and I mean, human rights need to be realised. And I think that's one of the things that we need to make sure that we've got a strong framework for in this country, is actually how do we realise those rights? You know, every child has a right to an education. The local authority has the duty to realise that right. Within that, there can be issues. So alongside rights, we need to think about who are the duty bearers, who are going to be the ones who are going to be working to ensure that there are frameworks, one, to realise those rights, and to look at recourse through the courts or whatever if those rights aren't being realized, because we have lots of, I suppose, being sort of like cynical. We live in a country where rights are disregarded quite often. We live in a country where it's not central to what we do at the moment and how we live. So I actually think there is something about shifting the framework and the narrative around responsibilities and rights and realizing rights in order to shift to the asset-based sort of human rights model, which is universal and therefore shouldn't be setting people up against each other or othering people. But we've got a long way to go in this country.
The last question that the time allows us is one for Stan. I don't know, Stan, if you can see from in the Q&A section, there is like, do you feel the well-being for future generation in Wales has done any good for considering and reducing vulnerability? Interested in hearing how this legislation has impacted policy and action in Wales, as it is not something we have in England. Very specific.
Yeah, massive work in progress. The Wellbeing Act is actually really oddly one of the things that brought me back to work in Wales, because I was sick of the siloed approach of UK government when it came to kind of climate policy, and it inherently makes us think more holistic about how we approach issues such as net zero. I haven't seen what I'd like to have seen in terms of how that can, like, what the implications for the Act could be for kind of this question on vulnerability. I think it comes back to like what this conversation is kind of highlighted for me, that looking at vulnerability, it just highlights and unpicks and makes visible so many of the systemic failings of our approach to climate change. And by looking at vulnerability meaningfully and like properly, deeply, you have to look at it as a structural issue, therefore, and it has to become a politicized discussion, which is not one politicians are really willing to have. So even with frameworks like the Wellbeing Act, there is still some very difficult conversations which are kind of all too easy to avoid, and very much kind of work in progress, I'd say. But it's helpful for us in Wales to kind of have this tool to kind of anchor conversation too. But there's still a big gap between kind of principle and practice.
Thank you, Stan. I'm just conscious that we have 1 minute. I'm so sorry we couldn't go through all the questions, but I think that not even if we have a whole day, we will be able to answer all the questions and to finish this conversation that is super important. In the meantime, I just want to thank everyone that joined the webinar, but also the speakers that get dedicated time for this. We will put a summary of the key points that were emerging in the website of the MACC. Of the MACC Hub. And again, just saying thank you to everyone, and please stay in touch